James Monroe was a Virginia patriot and skilled diplomat who became the fifth President of the United States. James Monroe, the architect of American expansion, was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia on April 28, 1758. He came from a modest planter family. He had a quiet determination about him. Monroe's early life was marked by the struggle for independence. He was educated at the College of William and Mary until the age of 18 when he left his studies to join the Continental Army. Then in 1776, his education was interrupted by revolution, and the young Monroe enlisted to fight for American independence, serving under General George Washington himself. James Monroe was a revolutionary soldier who saw combat at some of the war's most pivotal moments. In 1776, when the British seemed unstoppable in their campaign, Monroe crossed the Delaware River with Washington on that fateful Christmas night. He fought at the Battle of Trenton where he was severely wounded, taking a musket ball to the shoulder that nearly cost him his life. Monroe distinguished himself through bravery and commitment to the cause of liberty. After recovering from his wounds, he served as a scout and intelligence officer. He endured the brutal winter at Valley Forge alongside his fellow soldiers. Monroe witnessed firsthand the suffering and sacrifice required to birth a new nation. After the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson, the governor of Virginia and author of the Declaration of Independence. This mentorship would shape Monroe's political philosophy for the rest of his life. Jefferson became his political patron and lifelong friend. Monroe absorbed Jefferson's democratic ideals and his vision for an expanding agrarian republic. In 1786, Monroe married Elizabeth Cartwright, the daughter of a prominent New York merchant. Elizabeth brought social connections and grace to Monroe's political career. Together they would navigate the complex world of early American politics. Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates and then to the Continental Congress. He became deeply involved in the debates over the new Constitution. Monroe was initially skeptical of the proposed Constitution, fearing it gave too much power to the central government. He worried about the rights of states and individuals. Monroe was not a Federalist like Alexander Hamilton or John Adams, who favored strong central authority. He aligned himself with the Democratic Republicans who believed in limited federal power and states' rights. Monroe voted against ratification of the Constitution in Virginia, though he later came to accept it once the Bill of Rights was added. In 1790, Monroe was elected to the United States Senate representing Virginia. He quickly became a voice for Jefferson's political faction in opposition to the Federalist policies of President Washington and Treasury Secretary Hamilton. Monroe opposed Hamilton's financial system and the Jay Treaty with Britain. He believed these policies favored northern commercial interests over southern agricultural ones. Monroe was a fierce partisan in an era when political parties were just beginning to form. The young republic was deeply divided between those who looked to Britain as a model and those who sympathized with revolutionary France. In 1794, President Washington appointed Monroe as minister to France despite their political differences. Washington hoped Monroe could improve relations with France during a critical period. Monroe arrived in Paris during the Reign of Terror when the French Revolution had turned violent and chaotic. Monroe embraced the French revolutionaries with perhaps too much enthusiasm for Washington's taste. He gave speeches praising the French Republic and criticizing British policy. Monroe's conduct in France angered the Federalists back home. Washington recalled him in 1796, effectively ending Monroe's diplomatic mission in controversy. Monroe felt betrayed by Washington and believed he had been made a scapegoat for failed policies. Monroe returned to Virginia where he was elected governor in 1799. As governor, he focused on education, infrastructure, and preparing Virginia's defenses. Monroe served 3 one-year terms as governor, strengthening his reputation as an able administrator. During this period, he faced one of the greatest challenges of his career. In 1800, a slave named Gabriel planned a massive uprising in Richmond. Gabriel's rebellion was discovered before it could be executed, but it sent shockwaves through Virginia's white population. Monroe handled the crisis with a combination of firmness and restraint. He ordered the execution of the rebellion's leaders but showed mercy to many of the participants. Monroe was a slave owner himself, inheriting slaves and purchasing others throughout his life. He struggled with the contradiction between American ideals of liberty and the institution of slavery. Monroe supported the idea of colonization, sending freed slaves to Africa, which he believed was the only solution to America's racial divide. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent Monroe to France on a special diplomatic mission. Jefferson wanted to purchase New Orleans from Napoleon Bonaparte to secure American access to the Mississippi River. Monroe joined Robert Livingston, the American minister in Paris, in negotiations with the French. To their surprise, Napoleon offered to sell not just New Orleans but the entire Louisiana territory. The French emperor needed money for his wars in Europe and wanted to prevent the territory from falling into British hands. Monroe and Livingston seized the opportunity, agreeing to purchase 828,000 square miles for $15 million. The Louisiana purchase doubled the size of the United States overnight. It was the greatest real estate deal in history. Monroe returned home a hero, credited with one of the most significant achievements in American expansion. From 1803 to 1807, Monroe served as minister to Great Britain, attempting to resolve maritime disputes between the two nations. Britain was at war with France and was seizing American ships and impressing American sailors into the British Navy. Monroe negotiated a treaty with Britain, but President Jefferson rejected it because it did not address the impressment issue. Monroe felt disappointed once again by the rejection of his diplomatic efforts. He briefly considered challenging James Madison, Jefferson's chosen successor, for the presidency in 1808. But Monroe ultimately remained loyal to his political allies and supported Madison's election. Monroe was appointed Secretary of State by President Madison in 1811. He took office just as relations with Britain were deteriorating toward war. Monroe advised Madison on foreign policy as tensions mounted over British interference with American shipping and support for Native American resistance in the Northwest. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 tested the young nation's resolve and capabilities. Monroe served as Secretary of State throughout the conflict, managing diplomatic relations and gathering intelligence. When the British invaded Maryland in 1814 and marched on Washington, Monroe personally rode out to scout enemy positions. He witnessed the American defeat at the Battle of Bladensburg. Monroe rushed back to Washington to warn of the British approach, but it was too late to organize an effective defense. After the British burned Washington, President Madison appointed Monroe as Secretary of War while he continued serving as Secretary of State. Monroe held both positions simultaneously, an unprecedented arrangement born of crisis. He worked to rebuild the army and organize the defense of other cities. Monroe coordinated with Andrew Jackson, who was commanding forces in the South. Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815 came after the peace treaty had been signed but before news reached America. The war ended in stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent, but Americans celebrated it as a second war of independence. Monroe emerged from the war with his reputation enhanced as a capable leader in crisis. In 1816, Monroe was elected President of the United States with little opposition. The Federalist Party had collapsed after opposing the War of 1812, leaving Monroe's Democratic Republicans as the only national party. Monroe won the Electoral College overwhelmingly, receiving 183 votes to 34 for his opponent. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1817, beginning what would later be called the Era of Good Feelings. Monroe sought to heal partisan divisions and unite the country after years of conflict. He made a goodwill tour of the northern states, visiting cities and military installations. Everywhere he went, Monroe was greeted with enthusiasm and respect. Even in New England, the former Federalist stronghold, Monroe was welcomed warmly. Monroe's presidency focused on national unity, westward expansion, and asserting American power in the Western Hemisphere. He appointed a cabinet that included former Federalists, reaching across party lines. John Quincy Adams, son of Federalist President John Adams, became his Secretary of State. Monroe trusted Adams to manage foreign policy despite their different political backgrounds. William Crawford served as Secretary of Treasury, and John C. Calhoun as Secretary of War. Monroe's cabinet was talented but also fractious, as these ambitious men often clashed over policy and political positioning. Under Monroe's leadership, 5 new states joined the Union: Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri. The admission of Missouri sparked a crisis over slavery's expansion into new territories. Northerners wanted to prohibit slavery in Missouri, while Southerners insisted on their right to bring slaves into any territory. The debate threatened to tear apart the fragile national unity Monroe had worked to build. Monroe supported the compromise crafted by Henry Clay that admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance in the Senate. The Missouri Compromise also prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 36°30' parallel, except for Missouri. Monroe signed the compromise into law in 1820, temporarily diffusing the crisis. But he recognized that slavery remained a dangerous fault line in American society. In 1819, Monroe's administration negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain. Secretary of State Adams skillfully convinced Spain to cede Florida to the United States and establish a clear boundary between Spanish and American territory stretching to the Pacific Ocean. Spain was weak and could no longer defend its North American claims effectively. The treaty was a diplomatic triumph that expanded American territory and influence. Monroe understood that controlling Florida was essential for American security and for protecting the southern frontier. Monroe's most famous contribution to American foreign policy came in 1823 when he announced what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. In his annual message to Congress, Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization. He warned European powers not to interfere in the affairs of independent nations in the Americas. Monroe stated that any attempt by European nations to extend their political system to the Americas would be viewed as a threat to American peace and safety. The Monroe Doctrine was bold and ambitious for a nation that lacked the military power to enforce such a policy. But it established a principle that would guide American foreign policy for generations. Monroe was asserting American leadership in the Western Hemisphere and protecting the newly independent nations of Latin America from European intervention. The Monroe Doctrine was crafted primarily by Secretary of State Adams, but Monroe embraced it and made it his own. Britain had suggested a joint declaration, but Adams convinced Monroe that America should act independently. Monroe understood that the doctrine elevated America's status as a power to be reckoned with. It was a declaration of confidence in America's future and its destiny as a continental nation. The European powers did not immediately accept the Monroe Doctrine, but they recognized that America was serious about defending its interests in the hemisphere. In 1820, Monroe was re-elected president with only one dissenting electoral vote. The story goes that one elector voted against Monroe so that only George Washington would have the honor of unanimous election. Monroe's second term was less harmonious than his first. The era of good feelings was ending as new political divisions emerged. The presidential election of 1824 was already looming, and Monroe's cabinet members were positioning themselves to succeed him. Monroe tried to remain above the fray, but the competition between Adams, Crawford, and Calhoun created tensions within his administration. Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay also entered the race, making it a five-way contest. Monroe's presidency saw significant economic growth and territorial expansion, but also growing sectional tensions. The Panic of 1819 had caused economic hardship, particularly in the West and South. Many blamed the Bank of the United States for the financial crisis. Monroe supported the bank and believed in sound fiscal policy, but he recognized the political danger of appearing indifferent to popular suffering. Monroe was not a charismatic leader or a great orator like some of his contemporaries. He was steady, reliable, and dedicated to Republican principles. Monroe believed in the Constitution and in the importance of limiting executive power. When Monroe left office in March 1825, he retired to his home in Virginia. Unlike Washington, who was wealthy, Monroe struggled financially throughout his life and into retirement. He had spent his own money on diplomatic missions and had never been adequately reimbursed by the government. Monroe sold his plantation and moved to a smaller property. He spent his retirement years writing about his diplomatic career and seeking compensation from Congress for his past services. Monroe remained interested in public affairs and corresponded with other founding fathers. He served as a regent of the University of Virginia, the institution founded by his mentor Thomas Jefferson. Monroe's wife Elizabeth died in 1830, leaving him devastated. He moved to New York City to live with his daughter Maria. Monroe's health declined rapidly in his final year. He suffered from various ailments including tuberculosis. On July 4, 1831, James Monroe died at the age of 73. Remarkably, he became the third president to die on Independence Day, following John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who had both died on July 4, 1826. Monroe's death on the anniversary of the nation's birth seemed symbolically fitting for a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the American experiment. Monroe was buried in New York, but in 1858 his remains were moved to Richmond, Virginia, the capital of his beloved home state. Monroe left behind a legacy of service, diplomacy, and expansion. He had fought in the Revolution, served in virtually every level of government, and helped shape American foreign policy for generations. The Monroe Doctrine remained a cornerstone of American diplomacy well into the 20th century. Monroe's presidency marked the end of the founding generation's direct leadership. He was the last president who had fought in the Revolutionary War and the last of the Virginia dynasty that had dominated early American politics. James Monroe was not as brilliant as Jefferson, not as politically skilled as Madison, and not as commanding as Washington. But he was dedicated, principled, and effective. Monroe understood that America's future lay in westward expansion and in asserting independence from European power politics. He worked to build national unity even as sectional divisions grew stronger. Monroe believed in the promise of American democracy and in the republic's ability to endure and prosper. He was a transitional figure who helped guide America from its revolutionary origins toward its continental destiny. Monroe's life embodied the revolutionary generation's commitment to building something new and enduring, a nation founded on principles of liberty and self-government, even as that nation struggled with the contradiction of slavery and the challenge of continental expansion.